He laughed at her for mopping floors. Then she spoke fluent Russian and exposed a $2 billion scam in front of 12 billionaires. His father's empire was seconds from ruin. The twist? She wasn't just the maid, and she was done being silent. 7 perfectly pronounced, fluently spoken words, in Russian. The boardroom fell silent. $12 billion men stared, stunned, at the woman who had just translated the deal-saving clause, flawlessly. And in that silence, only one face burned redder than the rest: Brandon Huntley. The millionaire's son who, just days ago, had ridiculed her for barely knowing English. He never even asked her name. But now the maid he mocked was standing between his father's empire and ruin. What would you do if the person you belittled became the only one who could save your future? Let me know in the comments, because Brandon was about to learn that lesson the hard way. But to understand how it all led to this moment, the boardroom gasps, the frozen face, the billion-dollar deal teetering on the edge, we need to go back. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Back to the beginning. To the quiet girl with the quiet voice who pushed a mop down marbled hallways, and who carried a secret that would one day humble the proudest, wealthiest, cruelest family in the city. Dalia Mwangi didn't complain. Not when her back ached from scrubbing marble tiles for 12 hours straight. Not when Mrs. Huntley left her passive-aggressive notes about missing fingerprints on the silverware. Not even when Brandon, the golden-haired, Ivy League brat of the Huntley mansion, threw his gym socks at her feet like she was invisible. She'd seen worse. Much worse. What was a spoiled millionaire's son compared to war zones? Compared to the nights she'd spent on cold embassy floors, translating peace deals between nations that hadn't spoken in decades? But here, in this oversized house filled with cold art and colder people, Dalia was just the help. Not a former UN interpreter. Not a Rhodes Scholar. Not a woman who once stood beside a king in Geneva. Just a maid. She had taken the job 2 years ago, desperate for something quiet, something safe. A friend from church had whispered the Huntleys were hiring. The money was good. The mansion was secure. And in Dalia's mind, anonymity was a gift. She didn't want to be seen. Not after what happened in Nairobi. Not after what she'd lost. The mansion was a cold kind of luxury. Everything was white. The walls, the sofas, even the dog. The kind of place where footsteps echoed and no one asked about your day. Mrs. Huntley floated through the halls like a ghost in designer silk, always too busy for eye contact. Mr. Huntley, Mark, was barely around, always flying between continents, closing deals, buying companies, shaking hands with presidents and dictators alike. And Brandon? Brandon was everything you'd expect from a boy raised with unlimited money and zero humility. Arrogant, but cruel in the way that only the ultra-privileged can be, the kind of cruelty that thinks it's funny to mock someone's accent or imitate their walk just to get a laugh from friends. Dalia noticed him watching her sometimes. Not in curiosity. In contempt. As if her existence in his family's marble palace offended him. But Dalia had her own rhythm. She worked in silence. She whispered prayers in Swahili under her breath as she polished furniture. And when no one was around, she read. Always read. Thick books in foreign tongues. News articles from Al Jazeera, Le Monde, and Commerçant. Texts in Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, and Portuguese. She spoke all of them, and 3 more. But no one ever asked. Especially not Brandon. Until the night of the party. Until the night he humiliated her in front of the entire ballroom. The night of the Huntley's Winter Gala was the kind of event that smelled like generational wealth. Crystal chandeliers bathed the grand hall in gold. A string quartet played Mozart by the fireplace. Imported champagne flowed freely, and the guest list read like a Forbes cover story. Toes, ambassadors, socialites, heirs. It was supposed to be flawless. Until Brandon Huntley decided to put on a show. Dalia had been asked, no, summoned, to stay late that night, wearing her neatly pressed maid's uniform to refill champagne and keep the white napkins folded just right. She moved quietly, head down, until she reached the edge of the East Wing ballroom, where Brandon and his Ivy League friends were gathered. They were laughing. Loudly. Recklessly. Like the world belonged to them, and maybe, in that room, it did. Dalia walked past, tray in hand, eyes low. Then she heard it. Brandon's voice, mimicking a thick African accent, grossly exaggerated. "Excuse me, sir. You want champy? I clean your shoes, Mr. Brandon. Maybe later I speak in 7 languages. Oh wait, I'm just the maid." The group of entitled young elites howled in laughter. One even clapped like it was a comedy show. Dalia froze. So, tray balanced. Face blank. But inside? A storm. Not of anger, not yet. Of memory. Because she had heard that accent before. Her father's. Her brother's. Her own, before years of study had softened it. And now, it was being thrown across a room like a joke. Like dirt. Brandon's laughter cut deeper than he could possibly know. Or maybe he did know, and that was the point. Mrs. Huntley saw it. She glanced at Dalia, then away. No apology. No defense. Just a flicker of embarrassment for having to witness it. But no one stopped him. Not one guest. Not even Mr. Huntley, who had just walked in from the back patio, phone in hand, frown on his face. Business as always. "Dalia," he called. "My jet leaves at 6 a.m. sharp. Have the suitcases ready before then." She nodded, silent. But Brandon smirked and added, "And maybe teach her how to tell time in English first, Dad." Another round of laughter. Dalia didn't flinch. Not until she turned a corner, far from the ballroom. Only then did her hand tremble. Only then did the glass flute tip off her tray and shatter on the Italian marble floor. She knelt to pick up the pieces, and whispered in perfect French, "Un jour viendra." One day will come. And it did. Faster than any of them could have imagined. Because less than 48 hours later, Mark Huntley's billion-dollar merger was crashing. A scandal was brewing overseas. His Russian partners were threatening to walk. His interpreters had backed out last minute due to ethical concerns. And the document, the one that could either seal the deal or kill it, had just arrived. In Russian. With a handwritten clause at the bottom. And no one could read it. No one. Except the maid. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that lit a fire inside you? What did you do about it? Drop your story in the comments. The quiet ones often hold the loudest power. Mark Huntley's face was pale. Sweat dotted his hairline as he scanned the Russian contract in front of him, or tried to. He couldn't understand a word. "Where the hell is the translator?" he barked into his Bluetooth earpiece. "You told me this was handled, Lewis." His assistant stammered something on the other end. Excuses, apologies, cancellations. Mark's hand clenched around the paper. Everything was riding on this. The Huntley Group was bleeding cash after 3/4 of losses. The $2 billion Russian merger wasn't just a deal, it was salvation. And now, one handwritten amendment, one clause, could change everything. Could kill everything. And he couldn't read it. A soft voice from behind. "Sir, I can translate that." Mark turned. And blinked. There stood Dalia, the maid, holding out a pair of clean cufflinks. At first, he thought he'd misheard. "What?" Her eyes didn't waver. The note at the bottom, it's written in colloquial Moscow dialect. "If you'd like, I can tell you exactly what it says." Silence. Brandon, seated on the leather couch scrolling through his phone, snorted. "The maid speaks Russian now? What is this? America's Got Hidden Talent?" But Mark raised a hand. "Let her speak." Dalia stepped forward. Controlled. Her voice carried the quiet power of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. The clause states, "In the event of a sanctions-triggered bank freeze, full liability falls to the Western partner. Refusal to comply will activate Clause 13A, a legal forfeiture of shared assets within a 48-hour window." Mark blinked. Brandon stared. Dalia continued, fluently, "It's a setup, sir. They're betting you won't read it. If you sign, you lose control of the joint venture the moment any political tension arises, which is already happening in Belarus." Mark stood frozen, paper trembling in his hand. Where? Where did you learn to read Russian? Dalia hesitated. Her hands clasped behind her back, posture flawless. I spent 6 years as a diplomatic interpreter for the African Union. Before that, I studied comparative linguistics at Oxford. Russian was my 6th language. Brandon coughed, but it wasn't a laugh this time. It was shock. Disbelief. Mark looked like he'd seen a ghost. His voice dropped to a whisper. You saved this deal. No, Dalia corrected gently. I saved you from losing everything. That moment shifted something in the air. Like a veil had been lifted, and the men in that room were seeing her for the very first time. Mark cleared his throat. Do you speak anything else? Dalia nodded once. 7 languages fluently. For more conversationally. I also read Latin and classical Greek. Brandon dropped his phone. Literally. It clattered to the floor with a clumsy thud, but no one laughed this time. That night, Mark called off the signing. By morning, he had renegotiated the terms, this time, with Dalia at his side. No one dared question her. She sat in silence during the video conference call, only speaking when necessary, translating key phrases, correcting intentional errors, and protecting her employer's empire. But this time, she wasn't just a maid. She was the mind behind the deal. And still, no one knew her full story. Not yet. Because Brandon was about to go digging. And what he would find would flip his entire world upside down. If someone shocked you with a hidden talent that completely changed your view of them, would you feel humbled or guilty? Drop your answer in the comments. Some masks are worn for protection, not deception. Brandon Huntley had never Googled a maid before. But now he could not. He'd told himself it was curiosity. That he just wanted to know how someone like her had ended up in his father's mansion polishing doorknobs instead of, well, running a country. But deep down, Brandon was looking for something else. Redemption, maybe. Or understanding. Or forgiveness. Late at night, with the hallway lights dimmed and his laptop screen glowing blue, Brandon typed the words. Dalia Mwangi plus interpreter plus Africa. And what he found? It wasn't just impressive. It was history. Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Polyglot speaker at UN Women's Summit. Youngest African woman to lead peace talks in Sudan. Survived Nairobi embassy bombing, 2016. There were photos of her standing beside world leaders, smiling shyly in front of bulletproof glass conference rooms, speaking to crowds twice her size with nothing but a microphone and a translator's badge. Brandon scrolled in silence. Then he saw the article, the one that stopped his breath. Tragedy strikes. Interpreter loses entire family in Nairobi consulate bombing. A targeted attack by political extremists. 17 dead. Among them, Dalia Mwangi's husband and 2-year-old daughter. Dalia survived, pulled from the rubble hours later. She declined all interviews. Resigned from her diplomatic post 3 months later. Disappeared from the public eye. Brandon leaned back in his chair. Stomach twisted. The mocking. The accent jokes. The champagne trick. He had mocked a woman who had lived through war. Who had buried her child. Who had walked out of fire and chosen to serve silently in the home of a boy who didn't know a damn thing about pain. The next morning, Brandon came down to the kitchen early. Dalia was there, making tea. As always. Precise. He stood awkwardly in the doorway. I looked you up, he said. She didn't turn. I figured you would. Brandon stepped forward. Voice quieter now. Why would someone like you work here? Dalia finally looked at him. Not with anger. Not even disappointment. Just tired grace. Because sometimes, she said, after you've lost everything, the loud world feels unbearable. You start craving silence. Obscurity. Simplicity. And because I wanted to see if people could see me without needing a title. Brandon opened his mouth, but no words came. Only shame. I'm sorry, he whispered. For what I said. For how I... You don't need to finish, Dalia cut in softly. You needed to learn. Now you have. She turned back to her tea. The question is, what will you do with that lesson? Brandon didn't have an answer. But he knew this. He wasn't going to let her story end here. That week, he asked to shadow his father's negotiations. Not to play businessman. To learn. To listen. And when Mark Huntley scoffed and waved him off, Brandon said 5 words that shocked him. Only if Dalia comes too. Have you ever had your entire worldview changed by a story you didn't expect to hear? What did it teach you? Share in the comments. We all carry invisible stories. Dalia didn't want to go back. Even after everything, after saving the deal, after Brandon's apology, after Mark Huntley began treating her less like a servant and more like a secret weapon, there was one request she had hoped would never come. But it did. And it came from Mark himself. Dalia, he said, tone unusually careful. The next phase of this merger, it requires face-to-face negotiation. She nodded, unsure where this was going. In Nairobi, he added. And just like that, the room spun. Nairobi, where the embassy fell. Where her husband was crushed beneath steel. Where her daughter's tiny hand was found clutched around her toy giraffe, one of the only things recovered from the blast site. She hadn't set foot in Kenya in 7 years. Not even to visit the graves. Mark was still talking. I can fly you first class, full discretion, full security, but she wasn't hearing any of it. Only the rush of blood in her ears. Only the sound of shattering glass. The sound she still heard in her sleep. She stood up abruptly. I can't, she said. I'm sorry. Mark blinked. You're the only one who speaks both dialects. Without you. I said I can't. Her voice cracked. She never let it crack. Brandon found her that evening in the rose garden, the one his mother kept for show but never watered herself. Dalia stood there in the dark, arms crossed, breath visible in the cold air. You don't have to go, he said softly behind her. She didn't turn. It's not about them, she whispered. It's about me. I'm afraid of what going back will undo. Brandon hesitated. You once stood in front of dictators. Brokers of war. What could possibly? My daughter died there. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. They found me pinned under concrete, Dalia continued. I heard her crying. Then I didn't. I was 10 feet away and I couldn't reach her. Brandon's voice caught. I didn't know. No, she said. You didn't want to know. No one ever does. The next morning, her resignation letter was folded neatly on the kitchen counter. She was gone. No note. No goodbye. Just gone. Mark was furious. You let her walk? Brandon didn't respond. He was staring at the folded paper. At the name signed in perfect penmanship. Dalia Mwangi. For 3 days, the deal stalled. The Russians grew suspicious. The language barrier widened. One misinterpreted word led to a threatened lawsuit. And Brandon? He was flying to Nairobi. With one goal. To bring her back. Not as a maid. Not as an employee. As the woman who had saved them all once. And who he refused to let be forgotten again. Is there a place from your past you've avoided, out of fear, grief, guilt? Would you ever return, to heal? Tell your truth in the comments. Sometimes, facing it is the only way forward. The sky over Nairobi was the same as she remembered it. Too blue. Too bright. Like it had no idea the kind of darkness that could live beneath it. Dalia stepped off the plane slowly, scarf around her shoulders, heart pounding in a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't supposed to be here. She'd told herself she never would be. But then came Brandon's voice on her doorstep in New York, rain-soaked, shaking, eyes sincere. Don't do it for us, he had said. Do it for her. So her story doesn't end in rubble. The embassy ruins had been rebuilt. New glass. New marble. But the streets still smelled of diesel and dust. Dalia walked it anyway. Stopped outside the small park where the memorial now stood. A row of names carved into stone. Her husband's. Her daughter's. Zuri Mwangi, age 2. A single yellow flower sat beneath the engraving. Left that morning by Dalia's sister. The only family she still spoke to. She knelt. Not to weep. Not today. But to remember. To thank the girl who once called her Mama, in 4 different languages. To promise her this story wouldn't end in silence. Brandon watched from a distance. He hadn't approached the memorial. It didn't feel like his place. But something in him shifted, watching Dalia kneel there, not broken, but alive. He understood now. What she'd hidden. What he'd mocked. What he now respected more than anything. The following day, Dalia entered the Nairobi Hilton conference room wearing a tailored navy suit. No apron. No gloves. Just quiet command. The Russian delegates turned their heads. She greeted them in flawless native dialect. Even they looked humbled. The meeting lasted 7 hours. Brandon watched every second. Silent. Learning. At one point, Mark Huntley leaned over and whispered, "Where the hell did you find her?" Brandon's reply was simple. "She was always there. We just never looked." By sundown, the deal was saved. No shady clauses. No manipulation. A clean, honest billion-dollar agreement, sealed by a woman the world once buried in rubble. That night, on the hotel balcony, Brandon brought Dalia a cup of chamomile tea. She smiled faintly. "Still think I'm just the maid?" He looked out over the city lights, humbled. "No. I think you're the strongest person I've ever met." She nodded, then turned to him. "You know," she said softly, "I thought hiding would keep me from pain. But all it did was make me invisible. Coming back here, I finally remembered who I was. Who I am." Brandon held her gaze. There was something new in his eyes now, not pity. Not guilt. Something deeper. "You're unforgettable," he said. And for the first time in years, Dalia believed it. Have you ever found strength by returning to the place that once broke you? Tell your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear that healing is possible. 3 weeks later, Dalia stood in a different kind of room, not an embassy, not a marble hallway, not a kitchen with silver trays and whispered prayers. This was the Huntley Group's annual investor summit. A media circus. Cameras everywhere. Reporters. Analysts. Live streams. Mark Huntley was expected to announce the finalization of the historic $2 billion Russian-African merger, a move that would rescue his declining empire. And standing beside him? Not a PR manager. Not a CFO. Dalia Mwangi. She wore a sleek black suit. Hair pinned. Eyes calm. The crowd shifted, murmured. Some recognized her. Others whispered, confused. And then, as Mark stepped up to the mic and cleared his throat, he did something unexpected. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to introduce the reason this deal exists at all." She was once dismissed as the help. But what she actually is the most brilliant mind I've ever worked with. Meet Dalia Mwangi, our new chief diplomatic advisor. Guess. Flashes. One stunned reporter actually dropped his phone. Brandon smiled from the front row. Quietly, proudly, Dalia stepped to the podium. Her voice was steady. "I didn't come here today to boast," she began. "I came to remind the world that brilliance has never been limited to boardrooms, last names, or bank accounts. Sometimes it scrubs your floors. Sometimes it speaks in an accent you mock. And sometimes it saves your billion-dollar legacy from crumbling because you never thought to ask it what it knew." Dead silence. Not a blink. She continued. "There's a cost to silence. And a power in being seen. I was invisible in this building for 2 years. And today, I no longer need to be." The crowd erupted. Applause like thunder. Afterward, reporters scrambled for quotes. Mark was beaming. But the moment that mattered most came quietly. As Dalia stepped off the stage, Brandon met her at the stairs. No cameras this time. Just him. "You changed everything," he said. "No," she replied gently. "I remembered who I was. And that changed everything." He reached out. "Can I take you to dinner? As in, not as your boss's son, but just me." She smiled, half amused. "We'll see." But she didn't say no. And for Brandon, that was everything. Have you ever watched someone rise after being dismissed and prove everyone wrong? Tell us in the comments. Stories like that deserve to be remembered. The apartment was small, but warm. Sunlight spilled through the windows. Plants lined the sill. A record player spun soft jazz in the background. Dalia poured tea into 2 mismatched mugs, her posture finally relaxed. She'd moved out of the Huntley mansion 3 weeks ago, Not in shame. In freedom. She didn't need to hide in silence anymore. Didn't need to shrink in the shadows of people who didn't ask her name. Now, when people said her name, it was with respect. Since the merger went public, Dalia had received 6 offers from international firms, all with 6-figure salaries and corner offices. She declined most of them. She didn't want skyscrapers. She wanted impact. So instead, she accepted a role with a UN-led coalition focused on rebuilding education in war-torn regions. Her next stop? Sudan. But first, there was a soft knock at her door. Brandon stood outside, holding a brown paper bag. "I brought chapatis," he said. "From that Kenyan place you said reminded you of home." Dalia smiled, surprised. "You remembered." "Every word," he said, stepping inside. They ate on the balcony, watching the sunset. No cameras. No pressure. Just 2 people, sharing air and peace. At one point, Brandon looked over at her, quiet, thoughtful. "You know," he said, "I used to think money made someone important. Now I realize, wisdom does." Dalia didn't respond. She just reached over, gently, and took his hand. The wind carried the scent of food, rain, and jasmine. Somewhere inside, her daughter's photo smiled from the bookshelf. Next to it sat a plaque, recently gifted by Mark Huntley. To Dalia Mwangi, the woman who spoke 7 languages, and finally, taught us all to listen. Her story didn't end in tragedy. It ended in truth. And a new beginning. Because the woman who once cleaned floors, now walked on stages. The woman mocked for her voice, now shaped history with her words. And the boy who once laughed? He became a man worth standing beside. What does redemption look like to you? Is it being seen, being heard, or something deeper? Tell us below, your story matters. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.